Привіт. Hi.
Вітаю всіх. Hello everybody. Here is it's 10 o'clock morning in Edmonton and 6 o'clock here in Ukraine. My name is Ярослав Грицак. I'm professor at Ukrainian Catholic University, and it gives me a special pleasure and honor to announce the beginning of a new seminar on early modern and modern Ukrainian history. The idea of this seminar was conceived by Professor Frank Sisson, director of Petra Yacica program, and Dr. Marco Ste, who is the director of the publishing project of this program. And our ambition is to have a regular discussion on the most recent publications on Ukrainian history. We particularly want to focus on the publication has been sponsored and published by Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies and by the Petra Yacica program. We have this ambition, we intend to have this meeting on the regular basis, so probably once a month. So therefore we ask you kindly to check the website of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, also our site, Ukrainian Moderne. And without further ado, I pass my floor to Professor Frank Sisson.
Yes, so I'm Frank Sisson, director of the Petra Yacica Center for Ukrainian Historical Research, and very pleased today because we will be hearing an interview and discussion of a new monograph in our series. This is the number 11 in the Petra Yacica monograph series of works that come out in English. It is also a very special volume because it was published jointly with Queen's McGill Press. We in the future plan to publish more frequently and volumes from our series with both CIUS Press and Queen's McGill. I might add this monograph also received some assistance from our institute, but also from the Canadian Foundation for Ukrainian Studies, and we are grateful to them for that support. It also received quite technical help from our Kozak Ukraine program headed by Zenon Kohut. He, Larissa Bielaus of the program, and Zenon's wife Zoriana all helped out in Englishing the last phase of this monograph, and we are grateful to them for their assistance. Now, this book on Mazeppa is part of what might be viewed as a turn towards 18th century Ukraine. And I suggest that you look on the website of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies and of the Yacica Center to see the booming growth of 18th century studies of late for our institute. We find this very interesting because we will be holding a conference on June the 23rd and 24th in Lviv, but of course in practice internationally as these conferences now are. This will be a meeting of the Ukrainian Society for 18th Century Studies, which will be founded at that conference. It was thought of when our colleague in Lviv, Volodymyr Sklokin, proposed this conference that it would be a rather small event and workshop. In the days of online and Zoom, we now have over 150 participants internationally. And I think that is quite a send-off. But if you look on our website, you will see that it says that in general, 18th century studies have been a marginal and even a neglected period in most narratives of Ukrainian history. That is, that have gotten a period that got much less attention than the 16th, 17th century or the 19th, and now, of course, the 20th century. I think that phrase probably is true generally for the 18th century. We'll return to it, but not quite as true of the period we will be discussing today. That is the period of Iván Mazeppa. And if you would like to see how that has changed, particularly in Ukraine, please look at on our website for the volume on 18th century Ukraine, in which you will find a list of the 21 articles we will soon be publishing on various aspects of new trends in 18th century Ukrainian history, predominantly by Ukrainian scholars and translated into English. And I think that shows how the field has grown in the past 20 to 30 years. But as we turn now to our discussion of today and our interviewer and interviewee, I'd like to go back to right after World War II, when Ukrainian scholars, both from former Soviet Ukraine and from the Ukrainian diaspora that had existed in Central Europe, largely around the Ukrainian Free University in Prague, but in other places as well, suddenly became refugees going westward in Europe and predominantly, in many cases, on to North America. And if we want to look at Mazeppa's studies, we could say at that time, somewhere on their transit west were Andrusiak, Kenchinsky, Krupnitsky, Ohloblin, Matskew, and Doroshenko, only to speak of those Ukrainian historians who dealt with the Mazeppa period, as well as 18th century specialists such as Polonska Vasilenko and Lev Okinshevich. That is, there really was quite an abundance of 18th century studies in the diaspora at that point. And I think in some ways that contrasts with what the situation was in Ukraine after World War II, and particularly when one discusses Ukrainian political, cultural, and social history, but particularly political history, where relatively little was done. But that situation was going to change quite rapidly. Within one generation, 18th century studies on Ukraine in the diaspora or by historians of Ukrainian background were going to narrow greatly. I may be missing someone out, but I think we have a duo here, a diarchy of Oris Subtelny and Zenon Kohut, both associated with the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, although Zenon did his PhD at the University of Pennsylvania and came to the Institute. If Oris Subtelny chose to follow the path of many other Ukrainian historians, what might be viewed the period of rise or upward movement. He studied the Orlik emigration as the height of Ukrainian political and independentist thought. Zenon chose quite a different topic, and in his work dealt with the integration or annexation of the Hetmanate into the Russian Empire. That is, he dealt with Russian centralism and Ukrainian autonomy in the late 18th century. What I will tell you is that it was a period, and he may say more on it, when most historians of Russia or the Russian Empire had no interest in this topic whatsoever, and above all were quite suspicious of any topics that dealt with a non-uniform or a unitary Russian state. And so Zenon's thesis, which came out as a monograph, had quite a great impact by those who studied Russian imperial history by presenting a new view of that. In subsequent works on his Making Ukraine, his studies on political culture, historical narrative, and identity, he has shown the paths by which he has studied both the 18th century, but drawn it back to earlier and other periods. And most important of all, his works have been translated into Ukrainian. And I think when we look at the list of the very numerous people today working on the 18th century, many of those in Ukraine, I think, would say that they had been influenced by Zenon's monograph and then his essays on Ukrainian history. So that is our interviewer. Our interviewee is someone very close to the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. Born in Leningrad, as it then was, and a graduate of Leningrad State University, she soon after graduation came to the Yatsik Center for Ukrainian Historical Research. Indeed, she was our first research fellow of the newly formed center. Spent a year in Edmonton in which she perfected Western Ukrainian dialect speech as spoken in Western Canada almost perfectly, something that impressed many, but above all impressed us all by her dedication to the broadest study of sources, literature, and historiography of what we had to offer at that point. And we are very grateful that the trust we placed in her came back manifold to us in her work in Ukrainian studies. She finished her kandidatska work at the Institute of History of the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences in Kyiv. So she is a Ukrainian graduate as well, and her doctoral work at St. Petersburg State University. From 2003 until now, she has been a professor of Ukrainian history at St. Petersburg State University. From 2004, she has been director of the Center for Ukrainian Studies at that university. Her monographs, her writings are numerous. Her work on archives and finding what was lost material, we feared, has given us tremendous amounts to the field. She has studied the early modern period broadly, dealing with, and her monographs include works on the Koliyushchina, the Koliyu revolt of the late 18th century, on Russian and Ukrainian relations from 1654 to 1658, a period that had been much neglected in the Soviet period, and therefore a new study that she could bring to the field. She has worked on the Hetmanate in the second half of the 1650s and studied the roots of the rune or ruina, and now, of course, has written a monograph on Mazeppa and the Russian Empire that has appeared in Russian and then Ukrainian and now in English. I also might say she has done a tremendous service to Ukrainian and Russian history by organizing the publication of an academic edition of the Velichko Chronicle or History. She did this with her cooperation of her colleagues in Ukraine, and that after almost a century and a half of waiting, we finally have this tremendous work on 18th century source on Ukrainian history available to it. And with this, I would turn the proceedings over to my colleague Zenon Kohut.
Well, thank you, Frank, for these introductions. And I think now it's time to actually talk to Tatiana about her book. But before getting to the book itself, I would like to ask her a few questions, background questions, such as, could you tell us how you became interested in Ukrainian history, your relationship with the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, and a little about your work prior to the Mazeppa book?
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies for this fantastic opportunity to present my book. I thank very much Frank and Zenon and all others who arranged this web meeting. And I'm it's a great honor for me to present my book today. I got my interest in Ukrainian history actually very when I was very young, when I was a child, actually, being born in Leningrad in the family of old St. Petersburg intelligence. We had a very nice library at home, and I was always interested in history in general and in military history in particular. And so I was 14 years old when my mother gave me to read the monograph of Kostomarov Bogdan Khmelnytsky, and I fall in love with Ukrainian Cossacks, and particularly with Ivan Bagun. And since those days, I wanted to learn more about this period. And even before entering university, I already was reading books and reading sources. I learned Polish just to study the Ukrainian history. And when I entered Leningrad University, I told my professors that I want to study hetmanate. How I got my relations with Kius, it was like in a Hollywood movie. I graduated from Leningrad University, and I was working at school and preparing my kandidatske, attending seminars of my professor Skrinikov. And once I met at this seminar, Dr. Andreas Kapler, who came to Leningrad to study in archives and in libraries. And he was highly interested that I'm studying the Ukrainian history. And he said that he will write to his friend Frank Sissin about me. Several months later, I got a box from Frank with his fantastic books. And I sent him back my first little article about Vyhovsky. And again, in 4 months, I received from him an invitation to take part in the fellowship, PhD fellowship in Kius. I attended this and got it. It was a great surprise, and I got absolutely fascinating possibility in 1990 to get rid of Soviet Union, to get out of it, and to get to Canada, where I opened for myself the world of diaspora, the world of Ukrainian diaspora studies. And it was, of course, absolutely great opportunity, which brought me at another level of research and of understanding of Ukrainian history. And when I got back home, I kept on studying the Ruina, and I was interested in the times of Vyhovsky, and so I made my candidates in that period, and my major interests were in the 50th, 60th century of 17th century, 60s of 17th century. And so before Mazeppa, I was studying a little bit more earlier period of hetmanate.
Okay. Could you also tell us, in your career, you not only studied Ukrainian history, but you had really a role in developing Ukrainian studies in St. Petersburg. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
When I got a possibility to start working in St. Petersburg State University, it was in 2003. And I got my doctorska. Right after that, I proposed to establish the Center for Ukrainian Studies in St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg actually has a very long story of Ukrainian studies. We can name many historians starting from Kostomarov and going to Perets, and by the way, Alexander Grushevsky, and many others, Fimenko, many historians lived and worked in St. Petersburg, so it was not something very unexpected to create such a center. And my idea was that in St. Petersburg and in Moscow, we have lots of archives and sources about the Ukrainian history of the times of Hetmanate. And I thought that the main task of the center will be to find these documents and to publish them, to introduce them to my Ukrainian colleagues. So this is the main goals, what the center is doing through all these years.
Okay, well, let's get to the book itself, finally. And your Mazapa book challenges a number of myths about Mazapa. What are some of those myths? How were they reflected in Russian and Ukrainian historiography? And how have you challenged them, or have you,
I think Mazeppa is a big myth. Most of people know about him from Byron or from Pushkin, and which has nothing to do with the real man. And also, I think one of the strongest myths is that in most of the historiography, the central event of biography of Mazeppa is 1708. In Russian historiography, it used to be called betrayal, and everybody concentrate on this event. I think this is not right, because there was 20 years of rule, and this is more actually important. Another, I think, very strong myth, which was developed by the modern Ukrainian historians, that Mazeppa was always against Peter. And this is what I raise in the book, relations of Mazeppa with Russian Empire, and how he influenced on the empire, how he actually participated in this construction of it. So this is, I think, is very also important. And there are many local myths, as I would say, like, for example, a story how Mazeppa got his power, how he became hetman, his relations with Golitsyn. The strong myth is that Mazeppa created actually the private ownership of the land in Hetmanate, and that he was the one who created huge estates of Cossacks elite. And I was trying to deal with each of those myths, and on basis of lots of news sources to study them and to see what was in the reality.
all right, so we'll follow up on that then. So what is your view of Mazeppa? What was Mazeppa's concept of Ukraine, and how did that relate to Tsarist rule?
First of all, of course, Mazeppa's idea was to bring Ukraine together, to get it out from ruin. I think his Duma shows it's very, very well what was his main ideas. He was, of course, he wanted the strong autonomy for Hetmanate, which includes both the ability of Hetman to rule the Hetmanate, but also it included the economy. For Mazeppa, it was very important that Hetmanate got a very strong economy with taxes, with money, because he thought that if he will, as a ruler, will have money and a good budget, then he will be much more free in his behavior. For him, it was very important that Ukraine will be a center of education, of culture, and that's why he supported and created and developed both education and culture in Hetmanate. He also, his idea was that with the support of Peter, Hetmanate would be able to deal with very important goals, such as security of the south border of Hetmanate against the Ottoman Empire. And that's why he supported so much the idea of Peter of Dnipro war against Ottoman Empire. And also Mazeppa hopes that with the support of Peter, he will be able to get back the right bank Ukraine and to reunite Hetmanate. So I think this was major goals of Mazeppa, which he was trying to achieve during his rule.
So can you say that he was constructing a Ukrainian state?
Yes, of course, but he was constructed an autonomic state in the frames of Russian Empire. At most of his during most of his life, he was not thinking about completely independent Ukraine, because he was very good politician, and for him it was absolutely clear that for that moment Ukrainian Hetmanate was not able to be fully independent.
Right. So you don't agree with the number of historians who claim that Mazeppa was trying to achieve Ukrainian independence?
At least not during most of his rule.
Okay.
In the end, in 1708, there was attempts to find independence, but again under protectorate of Swedes.
Right. Now, if Mazeppa was a builder of also of the Russian Empire, what did he achieve for the Russian Empire? In what way was he the builder of a Russian Empire?
He was a very good helper and supporter of ideas of Peter, at least at the first stage of their relations, and I would say first 10 years, when the major goal of Peter was to get into the south, to get the routes to Black Sea and to fight Ottoman Empire. And this goal was very similar to the goals of Mazeppa, and that's why he supported him very much. And the Ukrainian Cossacks helped a lot to achieve huge victories over Ottoman Empire in 90s. Also, Mazeppa was playing a very important role in the foreign policy of the Russian Empire. Almost all south direction of foreign policy of Russia was under control of Mazeppa. All the relations with Ottoman Empire, with Moldavia and Wallachia, with Transylvania, with Greek Orthodox authorities, and also he was very much involved in the relations with Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. In a separate chapter, I studied this involvement of Mazeppa in the foreign policy of Peter, and it's very impressive. And of course, maybe the major achievement of Mazeppa in the building of Russian Empire is the introduction of Ukrainian Baroque into Russia, introduction of Ukrainian Baroque culture to Russia, in supporting by Mazeppa of major church authorities, which got all major position in Russian Empire, and for the next 100 years they would be mostly Ukrainians on the top positions of all archbishops of Russian Empire, as well as most of, actually all of Russian high schools which will appear during Peter's rule, like Greco-Slaviansky Academy in Moscow, or the school of Feofan Prokopovich in St. Petersburg. They were all set up by Ukrainians, and this was an achievement of Mazeppa, who started this process. So I think this is very important. It's first of all important for Russia, because in Russia there is no such deep understanding of the influence of Ukrainian culture for Russian Empire of 18th century.
Ask you something about Mazeppa's sense of authority. You know that he was sort of vacillating between being a hetman and a prince, or trying to be on both stools, and how would the hetman's authority relate to Tsar's authority, in his view?
It's again very interesting question, and I think we need to start from the beginning, that Mazeppa was a person who actually supported Peter during Peter's revolt, when he was struggling for the full power against Sofia. And Mazeppa supported Peter and played a very important role in these events. And from this particular minute, he got very strong influence on Peter, and got from him lots of privileges for autonomy of hetmanate. And so his relations with Peter was very difficult, but again, first 10 years they were very successful. Mazeppa understood Peter very well and was able to do things which pleased Peter. But then later, when the North War started, everything became much more difficult, and I studied the role of colleagues and friends of Mazeppa in Russia. It's very interesting for me, his relations with Fyodor Golovin or Boris Sheremetyev, who were his friends and supporters. Like I used, I think, 400 letters of Mazeppa to Golovin and vice versa, and it shows a very friendly relations and deep understanding of each other. But when all the generation of these Russian figures were dismissed by new ones, such as Menshikov, Mazeppa got a big problem in understanding and in finding the ways of cooperation. So there were different stages in his relations with Peter and with Russian Empire, and hopes and ideas which he and his supporters had at the first stage, they appeared to be not exactly as they expected on the second stage, and the final was real tragic.
Yes, but how did he imagine his own authority? Some sort of sub-ruler in the empire, a co-ruler of an autonomous Ukraine, and again, his attempts at becoming a prince. How real was that, and how did that relate to the traditional authority of a hetman?
Well, I actually don't think that he ever wanted to be a prince. When he got a title of prince from Peter, he was very much upset. And he even, in the last years, he tries to refuse his title of hetman and propose Starshina, that they will find somebody else, another person. He didn't have kids, and after the death of his Ivana Bidovsky, he didn't have a successor. And so for him, he actually believed that he would be the only person who can save Ukraine in a very difficult situation of 1707, 1708. And it's another question, was he right or he was mistaken? But, and of course, after 20 years of power, his position in Ukraine was different if to compare it from the beginning of his rule. He dismissed many of his oppositions, people who were in opposition against him. He even killed Vasil Kochubey, and in certain way he was a very strong ruler who didn't want so much to share his power in the last years of his life. But he didn't want to be a prince. He just was looking for the way to save hetmanates, to save things which he loved, in which he trusted. And so that was his major tragedy of the end of his life.
And this thing, being a prince of the Holy Roman Empire, was that important? Because later on, much is made out of it.
Yes, I think yes. He was a very well-educated European person, and his ideas were coming from modern to him Europe.
That's it. All right. So you're not going to comment on the, this whole issue about his princedom, being a prince?
I mean, I actually don't trust any of the sources that are saying that he was trying to become a prince. This is the story of his relations with Leszczyński and Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and his negotiations with Swedes. I studied very, very carefully, and I introduced lots of new documents for that. And in this sense, I agree with Ukrainian authors of the 20th century that he actually didn't have any agreement with Leszczyński, that he was not going to become prince from Leszczyński. He didn't trust Leszczyński, didn't trust Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and he got only the union agreement with Swedes, but in the very, very last minute, when he didn't have any other choice, and it was actually too late to arrange a real ally with Swedes, because he was not able to bring his troops in to Charles XII, and so it was too late to make such decision.
Yes, and I agree entirely with you on the issue of Leszczyński and his relationships with Leszczyński, by the way. Okay, so let's move something further to what new source material were you able to find? How did these materials change our knowledge about Mazapa?
Well, when I was writing the first book about Mazeppa, and it was in 2007, I was looking for new sources, of course, and it was a major challenge to find them. First of all, I was very lucky to find Baturinsky archive in St. Petersburg, which was later published by my center. And it has more than 1,000 letters or copies of these letters from from a Bactrian archive, from Mazepa's archive, which are mostly incoming letters, but it shows absolutely different picture of relations of Mazepa with Russian authorities. It's very interesting sources, and it opens a full picture of his involvement in the foreign policy of Russian Empire. Also then, of course, I was working in Moscow archive, which is a huge place where there are thousands of documents about Mazepa's period. And in my work, I never calculated how many new documents were introduced, but this is blocks of documents, like letters with Golovin, letters with Menshikov. There are extremely interesting sources about Mazepa during revolt of Peter against Sofia, how he was in Moscow, how was his negotiation with Sofia and later with Peter carry out, what he did get for their autonomy. So it changed the whole picture of his relations. There is lots of documents, blocks of documents about the time when Mazepa was becoming hetman. I found actually the original letter signed by Cossack elite against Hetman Samailovich with the original handwriting. And so all this helped to revise our knowledge about these events. Also, there is, of course, lots of letters of Mazepa to Peter the Great, the relations during the war, during the Northern War, and how the large problems in relations raised up and how they were tried to deal with that. So this is thousands of documents which are mostly in the archive of Asian Acts in Moscow, which is a golden collection of materials on Ukrainian history, and I spent the years working with these materials.
Okay, thank you. Now, how would you evaluate 20th century Ukrainian historiography on Mazapa, like Orlov, Krupnitsky, Konchitsky, Septenny, and also 21st century, like Chukhlip, Pavlenko, and others? Big topic, yes.
Yeah. First of all, I would say that Ukrainian studies of the 20th century, they created the foundation for the study of Mazepa. And of course, in my research, I was based on those books. I think the best biography which was written in the 20th centuries was a book of Agloblin. I actually liked it most. Though we need to understand that when he was writing the book, he was already living in US and he was not able to get in Moscow archives. And he was using some of the documents by heart, what he remembered when he saw these documents in Moscow many, many years ago. And so some of his notes were not exactly correct, and also there are lots of gaps in his biography just because he didn't have enough material. But in general, I think it was a great biography and very useful for myself. Regarding Krupnitsky, I would say that I don't like so much his biography of Mazepa, but he did great studies in articles based on Swedish archives, and especially in a publication in 1938, which was done in Warsaw just before the war. And it includes fantastic articles and, of course, study of Krupnitsky and Kantinsky of Swedish archives. This gave a fantastic basis for the future study of Mazepa's period. But for Kantinsky, I actually think that for him, Mazepa was mostly villain or bad guy. He didn't like him, and in his books, he introduced him a little bit in a black way. Regarding Subtelny, of course, he introduced fantastic materials, Polish materials, and did some very interesting studies of Mazepa's idea, and he was trying to compare it with events in Europe. And I was very lucky in my life. I actually met Ares Subtelny. We met once during conference in Milano. And in those days, I was writing my book on Mazepa, my first book. And we spent 2 days just talking. I was telling him my ideas about Mazepa, about my future book. And we forgot about conference. We were just talking about Mazepa. And for me, it was absolutely great opportunity to share my views and to discuss them with him. And when the book appeared, he supported it very much. And for me, it was a great honor.
Would you want to comment about 21st century historians?
The names you mentioned, I would say about Pavlenka, I think the major problem of his studies is that he is not professional historians. And I actually see lots of mistakes in his way of he works with sources and documents, and he don't have the basic knowledge of how to how to deal with sources. I think this is a major problem of these books, but definitely they give some interesting ideas which we can agree or not, with which we can discuss, and
Yeah, Pavlenko publishes about 2 books a year on Mazeppa.
yes, and I looked at the last one, and well, I was disappointed very much. First of all, that really I know what I see many mistakes, and I see many mistakes, in using the sources. And I think this is not professional work, but for popular reasons, it's a good work. Why not?
Well, he does collect an enormous amount of material.
Yes, but sometimes he don't understand which are real, which are not, which can be trusted, in which way, and so on. So this is
Right. Okay, yeah. I guess the last question before we get into giving opportunity for our listeners to ask you a question. And this is, what is the reaction to the Russian and Ukrainian versions of your book? And what are your expectations for the English version?
my first book on Mazepa appeared in Russia. It was not exactly what we are now discussing. It was a biography of Mazepa, which appeared in a very popular series, The Life of Great People. And for many people, especially old generation, it was a shock that Mazepa could appear in this series, and many of them were personally abused. Amongst them were some very VIP people, and who couldn't forgive me for that. But after that, 4 years later, Mazepa and Russian Empire has appeared, and we had lots of very serious discussions with my colleagues in major journals, presentations, in private relations. And 15 years later, I'm very proud to say that the general opinion about Mazeppa has strongly changed. Before this presentation, I checked Russian Wikipedia and major web sources with the biography of Mazeppa, and they all said that Mazeppa was very well educated, that he learned a lot from Europe, that he was was successful and helpful to Peter in wars, and etc., etc. And none of them is using, even Wikipedia is using the word betrayal or traitor. I was extremely happy and proud of this. They all use my term, my own term, going over to Swedes. And I think it's a great achievement, and it's very big change in the minds of at least professional historians of Russia. I know that the major scholars who study Peter the Great, they share my ideas about Mazeppa, like Anisimov, Sidov, and others. So this is very interesting and pleasant for me, of course. And regarding the Ukrainian reaction, when the book appeared, I got many letters, and during my presentations of the book shows in Kyiv and Lviv, I met many people who just came to tell me thanks for this book. And one of the maybe most interesting events for me was that I read in one interview of Bogdan Stupka when he was working on his role of Mazeppa. He read my book, and also in few months ago when I was in Kyiv during the presentation of Velichka, one of the sponsors of the edition told me that that particular day her daughter was having test in Ukrainian history in Kyiv Могила Academy, and the question which she was going to answer is 5 reasons why Mazeppa went to Swedes according to Tairova. So I felt myself like a classic writer. It was very funny. But in general, of course, the discussions both in Ukraine and Russia was very interesting, very fruitful, and helped me to develop the book. And when I was preparing the English edition, I made lots of changes. I made lots of additions. I was introducing some new documents, and so now I will be working on the new edition of Ukrainian Mazeppa as well.
Okay, now I think I will pass it over to Alexander to handle the questions that are going to come from the audience. Thank you very much, Tatiana.
Thank you.
Hello, we have several questions that we received. So some questions actually were already answered, but I will read them due to respect. So, and maybe we will be able to comment on them. So the first question comes from Volodymyr Mezentsev. So, and it is about his title of prince also. So Volodymyr Mezentsev provides the comment. So before and after concluding the political and military alliance between Ukraine and Sweden in 1709, and in Western European, American, and mostly frequently in Austrian official documents and press, Mazeppa was referred as a prince. So his questions are: Whether Mazeppa was also acknowledged as the prince in any Russian documents, particularly after he was awarded with the title of Prince of the Holy Roman Empire on September 1st, 1707. And the second question, did Mazeppa use himself a princely title in his own official letters, notably in 1707, 1708? And also we have a comment from Thomas Primark about this question also. My understanding is that prince was a very vague title in 18th century. It didn't really mean much.
Thank you very much. And I thank very much Vladimir Mezentsev for great question. Mazeppa did actually get a title of prince from Holy Empire. This was arranged by Peter together with the title of prince for Menshikov. But I didn't see any letters of Mazeppa where he signed as a prince. I need to check and revise this. I'd never noticed any. Maybe they exist, but I didn't see any of them. And in Russian, letters, the problem is that we almost don't have the originals of official letters going out from Moscow to Mazeppa in the last years. We have only copies which mostly didn't include the whole title. Mazeppa, Peter always used only just Hetman, Господин Hetman. That was the only way he wrote to Mazeppa. So it's a very interesting question. I need to look through what we have to see if ever this title was actually used. Mazeppa didn't like the title. He, as if we trust Orlik, he said that this is a way to get his hetmancy instead to give him the title of prince. So Mazeppa was very much against this title. In panegyrics, maybe some use of title we can find, but in letters for right now, I never saw.
Could I interject here for a second? You're quite absolutely right, Tatiana. Where do you see from the Russian side the use of prince is in the whole the various attacks on Mazeppa after he defected. And in the manifestos from Peter, from others, it always says he was so ungrateful because Peter got him the title of prince and so on of the Holy Roman Empire. So in that discourse, it was used, but I never saw Mazeppa using it.
Okay, so the next question comes from Alexander Truchin, four-year PhD student of history, but he didn't provide from what university. So question, why the scholarship about Mazeppa in Eastern and indeed Western Europe is still preoccupied with the overemphasized ethical question of his loyalty and refuses to study him as a military leader and to present him first and foremost as a Ukrainian military commander, managing strong Cossack corps, which was his main source of social and perhaps economic dividends. He seems to be reluctant to lose his military manpower, parts of which he rented out to facilitate the combat operations of other belligerents of the Great Northern War because it threatened his own existence?
First of all, I want to say that it's a very limited understanding of hetman as a military leader. In the end of the 17th century, hetman was not so much military leader in compared to Khmelnytsky, but he was mostly politician and the leader of the huge hetmanate as an autonomic state. In the chapter which I studied the internal policy of Mazeppa, we can see how he arranged the system of taxes in hetmanate, which brought huge incomes for the budget of Ukraine. And this budget became the source for this development of culture, of church, of education, etc. So this is not a military leader, this is a politician who is thinking about different ways of development of state. I think it's a very important thing to understand. And Cossacks were not the only military sources of Ukraine, they also have the army which was which served for money. This was introduced already by Samailovich, Gadukis, streets, sorry. And so this army, which was serving on the basis of money, became the major part of military strengths of hetmanate during Dnipro war, and actually Azov and Kazikirment were taken over by those troops mostly, not only by Cossacks, regular registered Cossacks. And also the events of the Northern War shows Mazeppa not a military leader, but a political politician, because his main goal was to use the North War to take over the power of the right bank Ukraine. And this is what the goal which many generations of hetmans were not able to achieve, since ruin when the Ukraine was collapsed into parts. They couldn't unite it. And so Mazeppa was actually first who united both banks. Doroshenko tried, Samailovich tried, but they all failed. And Mazeppa was able to do this. So this was a very big victory and achievement of politician and not of a military leader.
Okay. So the next question also from Thomas Premacht, because he was actually provided as a remark. In this particular book, you do not say much about Motra Kochubey. There is some divergence of views about their relationship. Could you talk a bit about this?
About Motra, I wrote mostly in biography of Mazeppa, but this was an event during the Northern War, when Mazeppa was able to gain the right bank Ukraine. He was very successful in that moment, and when he came back home to Baturin, he saw Motra, and being after it was already 2 years as Mazeppa's wife died, and so he has all opportunities to get married again. So this romance really took place, and as I can see from the sources, Motra wanted very much to be Mazeppa's wife, but the position of Vasil Kochubey, who was in a strong opposition to Mazeppa and who wished to become hetman himself from the first minute when Mazeppa got his power in 1687, since those days, Kochubey was always in opposition to Mazeppa, and he and his wife refused for this marriage of Mazeppa. So, and Motrya married another Cossack officer who later became a supporter of Mazeppa and went over to Swedes. So probably Motrya spent her last years in Siberia, probably.
Next question is from Danilo Leshchishin. How did Mazeppa view Bogdan Khmelnytsky? Did Mazeppa perceive himself as uniquely more suited to the task of fulfilling Khmelnytsky goals than Khmelnytsky himself?
I think one of the strongest features of Mazeppa was that he had time, probably even before he became hetman. 10 years of service at Samilovich and before service at Doroshenko gave him time to rethink all history of hetmanate and to understand what was mistakes, what were goals of hetmanate, what should be achieved. And when he gained his power, he was ready to rule, and he knew exactly what he wanted to achieve. He was saying that hetmanate suffered from the beginning of uprising of Bogdan Khmelnytsky because of the inconvenience, because of the struggle for power between Cossack officers, and for him this was a major goal to overcome this by different ways. He didn't kill anybody for the first 20 years of his rule, but he was able to achieve a situation when most of the opposition was ruined and he got a stronger power. So the stronger power of the hetman, this was, I think, Mazeppa's goal, because he understood that the major reasons of the ruin were not so much external but internal factors.
The next short question is from Elizabeth Volkener. What were Mazeppa's relations with Poland?
Yeah. It's a long story. His relations with Poland were not easy because he spent his youth at the court of King Jan Kazimir, and his memories of those days were not the best. His relations with Polish Szlachta was a very difficult one. They didn't want to acknowledge in him a gentle Szlachtich, and they didn't want to acknowledge him as a same level person as Polish Szlachta. And so after several years of being at court, Mazeppa decided to leave it and went to Doroshenko, who was a major enemy of Polish king, and started to serve to Doroshenko. And since those days, in all his letters, in all his documents, he was saying very negative things about Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and Poles themselves. He never trusted them, and he was saying that Poland is dying as ancient Rome, and he saw that he understood deeply all problems of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth of the end of the 17th century. So that actually was major reasons why he didn't want to get a union with Leszczynski, because he didn't trust him, and he didn't trust the whole policy of Poles. And actually, the beginning of 18th century was the years of struggle of Mazeppa for the right bank Ukraine against Poles. And when he took it over, it was a great conflict with Poles who didn't want to lose right bank Ukraine, and that made relations of Mazeppa and Polish magnateria just terrible. I also introduced lots of new documents about this story, about his fight for the right bank Ukraine.
The next question comes from Volodymyr Sklokin. If we speak about the research on Mazeppa, I think we face a paradoxical situation. On the one hand, Mazeppa's hetmancy is one of the best studied periods in early modern Ukrainian history. But on the other, we do not yet have an up-to-date comprehensive Ukrainian or English language academic biography of Mazeppa. I'm wondering, what is the state and prospects of research into the Polish period of his life? And don't you plan to write such a biography?
In certain sense, I did write such biography because the one which was done in a life of great people, and then it was revised and published in Ukrainian. The Polish period of Mazeppa, I have some ideas of studying it, but I think there is a huge lack of sources, because in those days he was not so important figure which leaves lots of documents whose name we cannot find in many documents. So this is one thing. There are some other aspects which are still not studied in biography of Mazeppa, and by the way, he struggled with the position. And I have some ideas of doing this in some future. But I think the reason why Mazeppa is not so well studied up to now is because it's a huge period of 20 years just of rule, and there are a great number of sources on these years in Russian archives. I used a big portion of it, but of course not 100%. I know that, because there are some collections in which I was not able to work, and so this is a huge period of Ukrainian history, and I think we will be coming again to this figure.
Okay, so next question from Larissa Bilouz. Was there a formal agreement between Mazeppa and Charles, or there were only some preliminary discussions about possible support and protection?
The agreement was signed after Mazeppa came to Charles. Before, there were only preliminary discussions, and this makes the whole story very strange, actually, because Mazeppa was a great politician, and that he didn't have a real agreement before he made this step. It just shows that it was a choice of the last minute, when he got order from Peter to destroy Starodubsky polk, and this was a very difficult choice, either to destroy the territory of Ukraine or to go to Swedes. And Mazeppa decided to go to Swedes, but nothing was prepared for that.
Okay, so the next question comes from Stanislav Mogilny. He thanks to Zenon for really good questions. And his question is regarding internal conflicts in the hetmanate. We know that most of the hetmans, like Bruchovetsky, Samylovich, Mnohogrishny, ended their rule because of conflicts between the local elite. Do you think this also made an impact on some Mazepa's decisions?
Yes, of course. And when he became hetman, he didn't have real power. For at least for the first 2 years, he had a very strong opposition, and he had a very difficult relations with Golitsyn, and he had a terrible agreement with Russian state. When he supported Peter, he got a new agreement, he got much more autonomy, and he was able to start to struggle against the opposition. The next 5 or 6 years, it was years of struggle against opposition, including Petrik and others. And only after he got a victory over the opposition, he was able to actually introduce many changes in hetmanate, first of all in economy, and then he was much more open in spending money for culture and education. So internal opposition was always a big problem in Ukraine, because of which hetmans were always limited in their policy.
Okay, so we have a really simple question. How old was Mazeppa actually when he died?
When he died, he was 70.
And the next question also, Mazeppa refused military assistance by Peter before going to Sweden. Why?
Refused?
Yes.
No, he didn't refuse. He sent most of his army to different frontiers of Northern War. He supported Peter very much against Swedes. Peter couldn't give support to Ukraine, and this was actually Peter didn't have opportunity to give him support, but this was against the rules. It was against the agreement between Ukraine and Russia. And it was a very difficult military situation for Peter. But of course, for Peter, Ukraine didn't matter so much. He had his own military goals, in which Ukraine was not on the first place, definitely.
Danilo Lechishin also asks the question, how much did the political views of Orlik, as depicted in the constitution he wrote, differ from Mazeppa's?
Orlik was a very close man to Mazeppa, who was raised by Mazeppa in certain sense, who was his general secretary and generalny pisarь, and also he was his own secretary, who knew many of secret ideas of Mazeppa, but I assume that not all of them. Orlik, when he was signing the constitution, was in absolutely different position rather than Mazeppa. He was a hetman without hetmancy, and he didn't have much Cossacks, and he very much was depending on Zaporizhia, which Mazeppa hated, and which he always tried to fight during his rule. And so what Orlik included in constitution was in certain sense compromise for Starshina, for Cossack officers, and for Zaporizhia. And also it was a compromise after rethinking the policy of Mazeppa, because some of officers didn't like his behavior on how he made his decisions and so on. So certain ideas in constitution of Orlik are absolutely great, but certainly this is a result of compromise and of difficult situation in which Orlik was.
Could I interject, since I've just written 2 chapters on Orlik and the Constitution of Mazeppa, is that Orlik pretty much was very much part of the Mazeppa, what I call the Mazeppan synthesis. So I agreed with everything up to the defection, the loss, and so on. And then in immigration, where the Constitution was actually written, there is a complete transformation. There is a new concept of Ukrainian autonomy, and so therefore Orlik changed the views of Mazeppa. In fact, he then not only of Mazeppa, but he changed his own views in the face of the loss, in the face of really Poltava and the loss of Ukrainian autonomy there.
I wonder if I can intervene for a question. I don't know where you are, Alexander, in your list, but something that I would like to ask after this, and then we can see where you're going. You discuss the concept of Otchizna and its meaning for Mazeppa and as a political concept. And I wonder, we see at the same time, or slightly later, the creation of a Russian concept of an Otечество. And I would be curious to see how you see the two as related. To what degree it was Ukrainian influence on Russian concepts, to what degree they developed separately. And I think of it particularly because there are, when you talked about Baroque, I thought of people like James Craycraft, who have denied that the Ukrainian Baroque has an influence on the Northern Baroque, that Russia is developing differently in Petersburg. And a number of Russian historians of Russia in the West, who have tended to look at a Northern influence, but not this Southern influence. So I wonder if you have thought of this, how you place that Ukrainian political culture in the Imperial Russian context.
Well, I think that influence was somewhere between 80 and 90%. I think the idea, the most of ideology of Peter was created under the influence of Ukrainians, first of all, Feofan Prokopovich. And all this came out from Baroque ideas and Ukrainian Baroque ideas. And if you're speaking about St. Petersburg, in St. Petersburg, all education was started by Ukrainians, by Prokopovich or by Politica, just a little bit later. My student is now studying how was built the Marine Cadet Academy in St. Petersburg, and was created by Politica and absolutely on the basis of ideas of Kiev Mohyla Academy. So all education which started in Russia, Lomonosov, this is a figure which was raised by Ukrainian professors in Kholmogory, where appeared the first school, which was created by Ukrainians, etc., in Siberia, in other parts of Russia. So the influence of Ukrainian Baroque and Ukrainian culture for Russian Empire was extremely great up to Catherine II. And I think that most of the ideas which were developed since Alexei Mikhailovich were brought by Ukrainians. Like the idea of Великой Малой Белой России was the idea brought by two Ukrainians, which formed this idea when this title of the Tsar. And the same was with Peter. Most of these ideas came out of Ukrainian philosophers and Ukrainian church leaders.
And then maybe just to follow up, there's a wonderful book called Van Loon's Lives, which was written by a Dutch historian in hiding from the Nazis during World War II, in which he would call back historical figures and they would have conversations with each other. So one thing I am very curious about, we're talking about Mazeppa and Peter. You, more than any of us, have gotten close to Mazeppa and personal relations with other people. Obviously, the correspondence with the Tsar is a very different thing. But can you imagine, these two as individuals in any other kind of conversations? To what degree do they connect? To what degree are they still alien cultures? I have often assumed when I dealt with the middle of the 17th century that when Adam Kisil goes over to Moscow, he really doesn't have somebody to talk to other than the Can you picture Mazeppa and Peter now in this kind of context, and to what degree have they become part of a forming cultural world that understands each other? What degree are they still separate?
I think there were some ideas which brought them together. First is the idea of the war in the south. Peter was highly interested in this, and Mazeppa was highly interested. That Mazeppa was a real expert in this, and I was really excited when I read letters of Mazeppa to Peter, when he explained how the war strategy should be made in order to make it successful, because he knew, he understood very well why the Russian troops failed during Crimea war, and he presented his ideas how to win, and actually they win. And Peter was so happy that he awarded him the title of Saint Andrea Первозванного. It was the highest title in Russia, the highest what Peter can do, and he was real excited by this. And another thing was the idea of Peter of changing, restructuring of Russian church, to get rid of patriarch and to make a new church with where they will be educated, where there will be much more European. And so this was a very big challenge of Peter, and he definitely shared these ideas with Mazeppa, for whom situation with Russian church was a very difficult one, because he himself got problems with Patriarch Joachim, and his friends like Monastyrsky, Tuptal, and others, they all got problems with Patriarch. And so Mazeppa, of course, shared very much the idea of Peter to change to this church and to make it much more open and much more educated. And that's why he supported so much the idea to send the best Ukrainian church leaders to Russian Empire. And so actually Mazeppa was who introduced to Peter Tuptala, Yevorsky, Prokopovich, and others, and who started this process in introducing of Ukrainian leaders in the Russian church. And Yevorsky became the head of Synod and so on. So it was a great cooperation, a very successful cooperation of these two people. But there were many other things in which Mazeppa didn't share, like the way of behavior of Peter, constant drinking. When you read the diaries of Sheremetyev or Gordon, you get it was unbelievable the way of Peter behaved. And Mazeppa didn't share this. He didn't want to drink with Peter. He didn't support, of course, most of both Mazeppa, Sheremetyev. They all were abused by behavior of Mazeppa and of Peter and Menshikov. And so this was very interesting, but in certain sense, they were very close in understanding each other, but in certain sense, they were absolutely different. And definitely Mazeppa couldn't present some of his ideas to Peter, like Peter couldn't understand troubles of Mazeppa because of the Northern War, because of Kiev, of the idea that Kiev could be given to Swedes. For Mazeppa, it was a tragedy, and Peter couldn't understand how deep, how real tragedy it was. And it's, you can see from the minute when Peter got to know about Mazeppa's going over to Swedes, that he was in shock. He couldn't believe in this. He wrote a private letter to Menshikov. He really couldn't believe, and he didn't understand what happened, why. So this shows that in certain sense they were close, but in some very important things they didn't understand each other.
We have a question from anonymous attendee. Professor Tayirowa-Yakovleva became interested in Ukrainian history by reading Kostomarov's book on Khmelnytsky. So I am curious, what are her views on Kostomarov's biography of Mazeppa?
I'm glad that my first book was not his biography of Mazeppa, because I actually don't like it. First, it has no compare by the a number of sources which Kostomarov used when he was writing Khmelnytsky biography and Mazeppa's biography. It's absolutely two different levels. It's a great study on Khmelnytsky and very, very low-level study on Mazeppa. Kostomarov didn't like Mazeppa. Well, many historians didn't like him. Grushevsky also didn't like him. But Kostomarov, unfortunately, was for different reasons, he was not able to introduce a real number of sources, enough number to understand the situation. Maybe it was because when they were publishing documents from Moscow archive, they didn't reach the years of Mazeppa. They were publishing only earlier years in Акты Юго-Западной России. And so maybe this was one reason. Maybe he didn't have time to get sources to write a proper biography. So.
The next question is from Irena Chalupa. You said that there are huge archives collections in which you were not able to work. Does this mean that there are still closed archives on Mazeppa? Is it possible that there are still many things about him that are unknown to historians? Are there white spots in your Mazeppa knowledge that you would want to answer to?
Yes, there are white spots and which I want to answer. But this is not what we would call closed archives. There are some collections which were not described. I mean, there are no descriptions of the collections. We don't know actually what there is in those collections. We know that there are documents about Mazeppa, but there are no inventories. And I have a challenge of trying to make the inventories of these collections and to introduce them to historians. These collections in Moscow archive, and as I said, it's a golden collection because all of documents from Hetmanat, they got to Moscow, and also there were copies of those which were sent to hetmans, and most of these documents prevents even during the Napoleon War, and that's why Moscow collection is absolutely fantastic, and we keep working on this collection. I have lots of friends in Moscow archive. I have my students whom I introduce to this work. And like when we now publish Velichka, we now want to go on of studying Velichka and looking for the documents which used Velichka and to compare them with what we have in Moscow archive. It's a great work for future.
Okay. So we have a question from Julia Pawlowska-Lich. There is a document in the Imperial Archives in Vienna, which declared that Mazeppa was granted with the title of Prince of the Holy Roman Empire by Emperor Joseph I. The question is, why didn't Mazeppa finally receive the title of merit?
It did.
He did.
He got this title, and this document was given by after Peter asked Empire to arrange such document for Mazeppa. It was in the very last minute. It was in I think 707, and even there was created a new gerb for Mazeppa. For Prince Mazeppa, but it was not finished because the event of 708 happens. But this title was given to Mazeppa, but he was really not happy with that.
So I can see that Professor Tairova will be working on many new topics. We today are particularly interested in that our public, and particularly the English language, those who prefer to read in English, have the opportunity to read what her accomplishment has been. And so I suggest we ask the director of our press to perhaps encourage our public to obtain this book. And after that, I think we would ask Professor Tairova if she would also then tell us a little bit more what she views as her potential research. So Dr. Stek.
Hello everyone. I am Marko Stek. I'm director of this Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies Press. And in my very, very, very brief word, I would like to echo a few remarks that were done at the beginning by Yaroslav Hrycak. Today's presentation is special for us, special for me. It's not because we did not have book presentations earlier on Zoom. We have had, but this is really a beginning of a new, more regular series. And we would like to, in this series, not only introduce charismatic and extremely interesting scholars like Tetiana Tayirowa-Yakovleva, but also first-rate books that the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies is publishing, or the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies is supporting with other publishers. This book has been published in collaboration with McGill Queen's University Press. This is also the beginning of our new series with them. And I want to say that the main goal of our new book presentation series is not only to raise certain interesting topics, not only to give you a chance to meet the author and to see in person what the person who actually wrote this book, but also to give you, to encourage you to go deeper in this, not only introduce the topics, but actually get more into the book itself. We want to encourage you to get the book and to read it. And perhaps we would come back with more discussions about this topic, about this book, on various other occasions. And so always before our presentations in this new series, we will have special discounts for books. Right now, just before that, since this presentation was being advertised, the book by Tetiana Tayirovoi-Yakovleva is on a 30% discount on the CIUS Press website. You have a link together with the information about this presentation. So I encourage you to go there. It will not be there for long. There is only 2 more or 3 more days left for this particular 30% discount. But I can tell you that the book is fascinating. It's really worth your while. It is a very high level scholarly monograph, which at the same time reads as a very interesting biography or sort of a almost sometimes detective stories. So I wanted to, on behalf of the CIUS Press, I wanted to thank first and foremost Tetiana Tayirovoi-Yakovleva, not only for her book, but also for her research for so many years and for her presentation today. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And now I assume that, Alexander, you can pass on the questions that you have on Q&A to Professor Tayirovoi.
Yes, we have some questions, but mostly comments, and they are mostly thanking Tayirovoi-Yakovleva for her presentation and really good book. So we will transfer those questions that we were not able to ask, and also comments to Tatiana Tayirovoi-Yakovleva.
Okay, and then if we may give our speaker and a chance to tell us where she wants to go from here in her research, both on Mazeppa and beyond.
Thank you very much. We have now several challenges which we are facing. First of all, we have now the academic text of Velizhka, and it's of course a great achievement, but it's also a great challenge to study this text. And we want to do it together with a group in Ukraine and in St. Petersburg, because we did some specific technical studies of the original Velizhka in St. Petersburg, and we want to do some researches on the pictures which are in Velizhka. I think it's a real mystery, where did he get them, and they're very, very interesting, and some of them belongs to the mid of the 17th century. So there are other studies which need to be done with Velizhka, and I think for the next several years, the team of my young scholars and of my colleagues in Ukraine, we will be working on this task. Also, we are now preparing the Ukrainian edition of the inventories from Moscow Archive, which we published, and it will be published in Ukrainian already in May of this year. And I think it's very important because it helps to find lots of documents in the archive of Moscow. By the way, the only known letter of addressed to Velichka I found during the preparation of these inventories. So this is a real great source for Ukrainian studies. And we also have a plan to publish inventories which are not known, which are not on the website of archives, which are very difficult to find. And this is a great challenge which will open 2 collections of fantastic sources of Hetmanate, which we've never used before. I know some of the topics which is about, it's, for example, about the events of 1686, of when Ukrainian Church got under control of Russian Patriarch. And we'd already talked with Vera Chentsova about these documents. She knows that there are some new documents, and there are many, many others. And so for me, I think it's one of the major tasks for the next years to work with these projects and to keep introducing documents on the Ukrainian history. And of course, I myself, I want to address some questions about Mazeppa, and I'm now writing a new book about the times of Khmelnytsky, and I think I found some other interesting ideas and interesting sources which I will be able to introduce next year.
Well, thank you. And so I think that what we have seen today is that there's a lot new to know about old history in a world in which people seem more and more to barely recognize the 20th century to its beginning as historical studies. We've shown how much we really have to know to understand the fundamental or the basis of both Ukrainian and Russian history through the study of this period, and look forward to your future research. I remind our audience to look on our 18th century to 18th century, both our conference and the volume that we have on the Yatsik Center website, on the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies website. I might add that although we are going to concentrate on books that come out either from our CIUS press here in Canada or our filiale or group in Ukraine, they will not be the only books. We hope to bring other authors to you as well. Indeed, we're in discussion with Vera Chentsova, who has come up with some quite remarkable new discoveries that push us back a little in time. Our next plan is to go, however, closer in time and to turn to the prize-winning book by Simone Bellezza on the Shistdesiatnyky, the 1960s in Ukraine, and to open it up. We also hope and look forward for any suggestions on how we can bring authors better to you and bring the books, and hope you will then bring the books to yourself in what will soon be a world in which we will not entirely be online, we hope. I'd like to, in particular, thank Zenon Kohut for conducting the interview. I would as well thank very much our author today for having shared this time with us. Now, are there any other announcements, or are we? With that, thank you, and above all, we thank the audience.
Thank you very much.